Vamos a ver, el aprendizaje es un proceso que tiene lugar en múltiples ambientes o contextos que no necesariamente pasan bajo el control del individuo. Es decir, el conocimiento aplicable puede residir en cualquier parte, por ejemplo, en una organización o en una base de datos. Y fijaos, se enfoca en la conexión especializada en conjuntos de información que nos permite aumentar cada vez más nuestro estado actual de conocimiento. A ver, yo no entiendo muy bien, no comprendo, parece un concepto algo confuso. Lo que sí parece cierto es que estamos adquiriendo constantemente nueva información que deja anticuada, obsoleta, a la que teníamos, que además tenemos que aprender a discernir entre la información que es importante de la información que no lo es, y que por otro lado, la información nueva que adquirimos altera la toma de decisiones. Estos días hemos estado compartiendo aquí, en este evento internacional Educared, charlas, ideas, debates, mesas de trabajo. Hemos estado en torno a una verdadera actitud 2.0, pero lo hemos hecho posible nosotros, los individuos, el origen y el fin de todo. Un evento de estas características merece un broche, pero un broche no final, sino de inicio, porque esto es una plataforma de retroalimentación constante. Yo creo que es un evento circular. George Siemens es el padre de la teoría del aprendizaje en la era digital, conocida como Connectivismo, que trata de explicar los cambios que la tecnología está llevando a la manera en la que vivimos, nos comunicamos y aprendemos. Para mí es un honor presentar de nuevo en este escenario a George Siemens.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to once again visit the beautiful city of Madrid and the beautiful country of Spain. I want to say a particular thank you to the conference or the Telefónica group for the opportunity to attend, and certainly want to express my gratitude and feeling rather humbled for the award. So I just want to extend my gratitude for both of those. What I'm going to talk about today is something that I've been working on over the last probably about 14 years. And it's been a primary emphasis on connecting. You know, how do people connect with one another to produce knowledge? How do people connect with one another to solve complex problems? How do people connect with one another to address the complex societal challenges that we face today? And you really don't have to look very far. Chances are, somewhere in Spain today, there will be groups of educators and groups of concerned citizens gathering in public squares because they feel some part of government is not right and is not working the way they want it to and the way it should work. Now, we've done this over the last century or two. People have met in public spaces over a period of time, so this isn't new. But what's new is that people now, through mobile devices and technologies, have access to one another and have access to information in a way that they've never had in the history of humanity. And so my work, my teaching, and my research has been focused on exactly this concern. Where do people connect, and how do these structures come together in forming new levels of knowledge in society? So maybe the best thing to do to give you a sense of where I come from is to go back to the year 2000. In the late 90s, I was at a college in Manitoba called Red River College, and we were the first college in Canada that ended up going to an exclusive laptop program, or I should say our department was the first one. And as a result of this, we ended up having new challenges and new concerns in how we taught our students. Every student had a laptop in our program, And what was happening is a lot of the educators were simply duplicating the physical activities that they had done in the past with the current technologies that they were using. Sorry, I'll just adjust my microphone. It's slipping around a bit. So what happened was the students were doing new and interesting things with the tools. They were downloading music, they were downloading movies, they were starting to connect with one another through instant messaging, and yet what teachers were doing, by and large, was they were taking what they had done before, the overhead slides they had used, and they were teaching it in PowerPoint. So what was happening is the students were changing because of technology, but a lot of the educators and the teachers were not. They were still doing the same things they had done in their career or that they had experienced when they were first students as well. So I started in 2000 with an interesting tool which at this point was very flaky. So what I mean by that is I would log in some mornings that would work fine, and I would log in other mornings and it wouldn't work at all. So there was really two technologies that I started using in 2000 that define still my view of teaching and learning. The first one was a tool called Blogger, and since then there have been hundreds, probably thousands of blog platforms developed. And these platforms, I'm sure you're familiar with blogs today, journalists blog, activists blog, parents blog, teachers blog. And it's a simple tool. You just share your ideas and you invite others to post comments. Now, when I was at Red River College, there was really only me that I could find that had the interest in technology that I did within the college. And I found interestingly that as I started to share my ideas online, that all around the world there were a few folks in different colleges and universities and schools that they were the only ones in this system as well. And so what they wanted to do was to connect with other people around the world and to grow their knowledge by being part of a network. But this network that they were a part of wasn't geographical. It wasn't students or other people in their own space. It was people that were in different systems, but there was only one or two of those in their system, so they came together and connected and shared their ideas in order to grow their knowledge as part of a network. Now, the second technology that I used that is less common today, we don't hear about it as much, but it's RSS. You probably use it if you use Google Reader, you subscribe to blogs, you subscribe to news sites. But RSS is basically a very simple way, it's an XML format, but it's a very simple way for people to connect. So we have two tools now. We have one tool, namely blogging, that allows you to create and share your ideas and post them in a very easy way. Text, audio, video, images. So it's an easy way to create and share. And then we have a second technology that's very simple as well, and that's RSS, Rich Site Summary or Resource Description Framework Systems for Syndication. These are tools that are very, very easy to use, and anyone, regardless of levels of technical expertise, can start to use them. But as I use those, the interesting thing, as I mentioned, is we started to connect not based on where we were located in a country or in a part of the world, but we started to connect based on our interest. We connected based on people who were similarly sharing these ideas or these resources. Over a period of time, this became known as Connectivism, at least within a small group that I was involved with. But within a larger group today, it's increasingly referred to as social network learning, which is how we basically connect with each other around the world. Now, another part, which is probably one of the most important aspects, is this concept of learner autonomy. Most parts of society, government, businesses, banks, are not very familiar yet with a fundamental shift that's happened in our society, and that's that the individual has more control than they've ever had. They have more control because they can create content and share it easily. They have more control because in their pockets, through a mobile device, they carry around a way that they connect with anyone from around the world with almost no friction. And so there's been a control shift. We see it in our classrooms, just like I mentioned at Red River College when in the late 90s we had students suddenly starting to do different things with technology while educators were doing the same things. And that put pressure on the educators to change. So this is the core of the change driving education, is that students have more power and tools for power than they've ever had. And what's distinct about it is that we increasingly participate as part of a process, so that knowledge is very much a living, adaptive kind of concept, rather than something that is formed before a student gets to a class. Let's say in a traditional setting, we would have a textbook. Student comes in, starts reading the textbook, we test them on that textbook, and then we give them a grade. Well, in a society such as we are in today, which is a complex, largely democratic information setting, individuals have the ability to contribute to that knowledge. So it's no longer just read this textbook and be tested. It's read this and then help us grow knowledge, create your artifacts. How do you see this? Share this with others. And then each artifact that you share becomes an important part of the next person's learning as well. So it's this iterative process. It's dynamic, it's ongoing, and it's very much evolutionary or emergent. And there are two important elements in this space. On the one hand, we're looking at networks. We're familiar with networks. We experience them daily. We might log into Facebook, we might log into Orkut, or we might use tools like Twitter. We use our mobile devices, and we interact with these on a constant basis as well. But what's important, though, is not just the network, which is the process of connection and connectivity. What's important is the spaces and the ecologies in which those networks form. Now, what is an ecology? Well, for our case as educators, an ecology is our classroom. So it's the space where we determine how learners can connect to one another. It's the space where we determine how learners evaluate and grow knowledge together. So an ecology then is the environment that determines the kinds of connections that learners can form. So with Connectivism, the main effort is to describe knowledge and learning really through the lens of connections, which means that if we want to describe how people learn, we think of it from a lens of connectedness. If we want to describe how knowledge is distributed, we do so through a lens of connectedness. And I'll get into a little more detail on that once I start talking about networks. But for school systems in particular, which have historically been quite hierarchical, namely it's been very structured and linear, for these school systems it's not an easy process to start transitioning to a connection view of the world. Because if they do that, it changes the autonomy of the student, it changes the practices of the teacher, it changes the nature of the curriculum, it even changes the physical structure of schools. And so my argument has been over the last really 10, 12 years that if there's a tool or a technology that's invented, and if that technology changes how information is created, if it changes how we share information, if it changes how we evaluate that information, or if that tool or technology changes how we connect to one another, how we have conversations, how we communicate, if it changes any of these elements, what people can do for themselves, then this is a tool that's going to change education. So if it changes information and interactions, and if it changes how we connect, it's going to change the educational process. But this presents a very big problem in our society today, because one of the scarcest resources that we have is attention. There's a famous quote from Simon that goes back to the 1970s where he says, you know, what information consumes is obvious. It consumes the attention of the recipients. Which means that if you have a wealth of information, you have a poverty of attention. And this is what I'm talking about when I refer to complexity in society, where we want to consider ways in which students can start to create and share information in complex spaces instead of sharing information in or simply duplicating information that's presented in a textbooks. So before I get too far on that line of thinking, it's probably a good idea to stop a little bit and talk about, you know, what are networks? Right? We hear about them. We hear global networks of all kinds. We hear of information networks. We hear of disease networks. So the simple answer is that a network is a node and a connection. And that node can be a person, it can be a database, it can be an information element, it can be a mobile device, or if we move up high enough, a network can actually be a node so that we can participate in networks of networks as well. But as I mentioned earlier, this occurs within an ecology. Namely, there's a space, and the space in which it occurs determines how connections form. Now, there's a lot of different networks and network illustrations. Here's just a few quick examples. On the top left, you'll see a network of an American blogosphere, which was, you know, during elections, how political bloggers were related or communicating with one another. Just over to your right, on the top, you'll see network illustrations of the brain. You'll see network illustrations of a file management system just underneath that. And if you look a little bit further in society, you see food webs. You see the networks of companies. Just looking at an article yesterday which looked at the global capitalist infrastructure. You know, how are banks related? How are the top several hundred banks related, and how do they form the global capital economy? So we can understand the world and see the structure of the world once we start thinking in terms of connections. Now, if we apply this in terms of teaching, here's an illustration of a course that I did in 2008, and it's one of the discussion forums. And what I did was I used a tool called SNAP, Social Networks Adapting Pedagogical Practices, and I looked at how are these networks shaped in this particular system. And each of these red dots is a student, and the lines between them indicate how students are connected. So if you look at your right side of the screen, you'll see a group of individuals that are called peripheral learners. These are students who are not well connected to one another, right? They're essentially connected with one post to someone, but they're not part of the conversation. But if you look at the middle of the diagram, you'll see several nodes that are critically connected. They're part of almost all of the conversations that are occurring. Now, this is just a very simple network diagram. This takes you 5 minutes to put together, but this can give us interesting insight into which students are learning from each other. How are students connected? And if there's problems with how they're connected, how can we help them to better build their connections? As I mentioned earlier, it's about learning to think in terms of networks, and once we understand network level thinking, then we can start to develop pedagogical activities that help to improve the connectedness of students. But it's not just social networks. This is an example from a site called Linked Data. So it's not just that we're connected technologically and socially, it's that we're also connected conceptually. Knowledge is a network. So how we take ideas and how we connect ideas determines our level of understanding. And so this is just a simple example of the different data formats that are trying to normalize, if you will, or at least trying to get data to communicate. If I took a field like physics, and I listed all of the concepts in physics, and I drew connections between those concepts, which concepts are related, which concepts inform other concepts, I would get a similar type of a map. So whether I'm talking about the social technical process of learning, or whether I'm talking about the knowledge dimension of learning, we're fundamentally looking at networks and network type of structure. So a big part of our activity then, as educators, is to make the world's knowledge relatable, to put it in a format that students can understand and relate to. But there's a difficulty that arises, which is once this knowledge is available like it is today, and that Simon quote about a wealth of information results in a poverty of attention, we come across a problem in open online courses where students end up being unable to make sense of everything, and they find different ways then, because students are creative, they find different ways of making sense of information, and they do that through social self-organizing systems. This is, I think, one of the most interesting areas of research exploration in the next few years, and I also think it's an area that's going to make a big impact in terms of how educators teach. Because students have access to the world's information now. They have, through mobile devices, instant messaging, Skype, Twitter, they have access to connecting with one another. So the next stage is they begin to form self-organizing social groups where they teach one another, where they peer teach, rather than relying exclusively on the educator. Because learning, after all, is a complex process. And our education system, though, treats it, unfortunately, like it's a complicated process. And I'll just talk about what the distinction is between those two terms. A complex process is a weather pattern, where you have seasons changing and you don't quite know what the weather will be tomorrow because it's dynamic, and these systems connect and interact in different ways. So we might think it'll be sunny tomorrow, but it'll all depend on how those weather patterns connect and interact. In contrast, a complicated system is mechanical. It's a system like a car, where if you're building a car, all the pieces fit together. If you take the car apart and you're missing pieces afterward, it probably won't work. So put another way, complex systems consist of dynamical interacting agents, often like a biological system, whereas a complicated system is often human-created and mechanical. And so in the learning process, we've made, through the design of our schools, through the planning of our pedagogical models, we've made learning largely a mechanical, structured process. When in reality, when we learn and when children learn on their own, it's very much an organic, complex process. And so when we look at the field of complexity science then, we look at basically three critical elements that result in an adaptive learning model. On the one hand, we have, as I've mentioned, the power of self-organization. Students can organize and teach each other. The educator is still important, but they have a different role than they've had in the past. Because of complex system, we have emergence. The system can change quickly based on how these elements interact. And finally, we have adaptive structures, which means that the curriculum changes based on the students that are participating and interacting. So each course will have somewhat different elements because of this adaptive element. And as a result of self-organization, the emergence of knowledge, we have this formation of learning processes that are dynamic and evolving. And so how we're connected, though, influences the type of information that we encounter. And this is where the role of an educator becomes important. Because instead of teaching people only information, we need to teach people how to form networks and how to evaluate the quality of those networks. Because if your network isn't giving you diverse information, then you probably need to optimize or rethink that network structure. Because the structure will determine the kind of information. Now, because of this tremendous growth of information And because of the development of information in many different channels, we've had a fragmentation of information, right? So instead of a textbook, we now have TED Talks, and we now have blog posts, and we have online papers, and we have news sites, which is a big problem, actually. On the one hand, it's very liberating, but fragmentation is not a good thing for the learning process. And the reason is that a networked information structure doesn't have a center. It's bits and pieces everywhere. You know, a textbook is a center. A textbook pulls together all of the information of a particular discipline or a particular topic, and then students essentially have to master the textbook to master the information. However, when the information is fragmented and all over the place, it can be difficult and challenging for students to make sense of it, because we need some kind of center or some kind of coherence in order to understand. And as a result of that, we need to develop structures that, even if information is fragmented, we need structures that allow us to interact with information as if though it's coherent. Because we need that coherence in order to start to recognize the patterns that exist in that information. So we need some centering if we're going to understand what's happening, let's say, in protests happening in Madrid. I believe there's something going on today. And so how do we follow that? There's no one place where we're going to find all the information, because people are posting it on Facebook, they're posting it on Twitter, they're sharing it on social bookmarking services, they're uploading images to different services. So how do we find a way to pull this fragmented information together? It's a vital educational challenge, because if we want to share and gain some relatable understanding of this topic, we have to have that degree of centeredness. So there's ways that we're doing this now. We're creating what I'll call temporary centers. And these are ways that you pull together fragmented, distributed information into somewhat of a coherent whole, so we have a bit of an understanding of what's happening. One example is this notion of hashtags, which you've likely seen during almost any major event, a sporting event, a political event. A group of learners or a group of individuals set up hashtags, and hashtags serve as a way to pull together information from a variety of sources. We also have the use of tools such as alerts. Google Alerts is a good example, where if we subscribe to an alert, these alerts are automatically sent out to us via email. We use tools and sites such as social bookmarking, and we use tags on these social bookmarking sites, which then allow us to gain a little bit more of a coherent understanding of how these pieces are, or how they're related and connected. So this, then, I will put forward, is the critical educational challenge that we face today, which is how do we create a central or a coherent message around a topic when we are accessing this information through distributed and through fragmented structures. Because to think deeply, to learn a subject deeply, takes time. It takes a period of incubation, and it also takes time for these ideas to collide. So we have to find a way to create a structure where this information can be pulled together in a meaningful way. Now let's look at how we've done this in the past. This is a simple model. I know it's a little more complex, but this is basically the educational process the way it's been conceived. You have faculty or teachers, you have the core content, which is the textbooks, the reading materials, and then you have the learners. The job of the learners is largely to be able to pull together or to understand the textbooks and the resources that the teachers provide. Now, there's parts that happen outside of this. Students meet and talk in the hallway, students go to the library, but by and large, this is the traditional education model. Educator, content, student. We have a very different model emerging today, and this model looks more like this, and it forms the basis of these large open online courses that I've been involved with over the last several years. So we have a model where, yes, you still have your teachers, you still have your students, but the content and the conversation is multidimensional. It doesn't just flow from the teacher to the student, it flows from external people outside of the classroom. We use open educational resources. You have external educators that come into our classroom and help us teach. So you have basically an ecosystem. As I mentioned earlier, networks form in ecosystems. This isn't a very well optimized ecosystem. It is an ecosystem, but it's an ecosystem that doesn't allow rich, diverse networks to form. In contrast, a model like this, where you have co-created content, you have content developed by students, by others who aren't even enrolled in the course, is much more dynamic and multifaceted. Now, in our society today, these are just a few examples of new trends or tools or technologies, but we have resources that are open educational resources. We have teaching tools such as the Khan Academy that provide good lectures, short, succinct lectures on topics. YouTube, we have open virtual university systems. We have digital textbooks that are freely available to students. So there's an awful lot of material and resources that students now have access to that the educator doesn't control. How many of you have heard of this word, the flipped classroom? See, okay, maybe not. I'll just talk a little bit about this and then detail what this model is, because I think there's something important here. The flipped classroom is a model that says, you know, in the past, we would come to a classroom and the teacher would lecture or they would teach us the topics. And then we would do our homework at home. Now, one of the problems is when you're doing your homework at home, if you do something wrong, you remember the wrong things. So the homework is one of the most important parts of learning, because you develop good habits and bad habits through your homework. The flipped classroom turns that around. So it says, at home, you won't do homework. At home, you will watch videos that are freely available online. You'll watch lectures that the educator has put on YouTube. You'll watch Khan Academy lectures. And then when you go to school, you will do the homework there, because now there's a teacher who can help you solve your problems so you're not developing the bad habits. And I think it's a great model, because that really makes sense. We need the teacher's help the most when we're doing the homework or when we're trying to experiment with the ideas. When we're watching a lecture, we really don't need the teacher's help, because that's more of a passive activity. So that's the flipped classroom model, and over the last few years I've been involved in what's called massive open online courses. And these courses I've offered in a variety of formats, and there's been a variety of educators that have also started offering same or similar models of courses. There have been about 15,000 students that have taken these courses with me, but there's models now such as the Stanford that has 100 and some thousand students in it in one course itself. So I've taught courses on open futures, on social media and education, on learning analytics, on personal learning environments, connectivism and connective knowledge. And currently I'm teaching a course called the top corner. You'll see change.mooc.ca. That's a course that I'm teaching right now, so if you're interested in joining a course, it's one that I'm teaching with Stephen Downs and Dave Cormier, but we have guest experts that come in every week and present 1 week of the content. So if you're interested in what these courses are like, you might want to sign up. What we use in these courses, though, is a wide variety of technology. And this is just a very, very small sampling. Everything from Second Life to Ning in the past to MediaWiki. We use blogs, we use Illuminate, now called Blackboard Collaborate, Facebook, Digo, Audacity, Twitter. I mean, the list goes on. Basically, every technology that's online and that's accessible gets used. Now, why does it get used? The main reason it gets used is because we don't decide for the learners. I mentioned that students self-organize in these large open courses. And the reason they self-organize is because there's too much information, we can't consume it all, so we create smaller groups. We create sub-networks with people who share our interests. In the first course we did, we had students that created groups based on their where they went to school. So you have a group, I went to school in MIT, so we'll connect there and other alumni. Or we had groups that formed physically. One was in Australia, another one was in New York. So these individuals got together and they connected with one another and got physically because there was a large enough number in that region. We had other folks who were very interested in Second Life. And so they would connect in Second Life, and that's where they would interact with one another. So that's what we're looking at with these tools that give individuals control, means that the students control the kinds of networks that they form, and part of our job as educators is to help them form better networks. Now let me tell you a little bit about what I think this trend is like. I've described this in the past as we've moved from dot to slash. And I'll explain that in a bit more detail. It used to be, if you were teaching online or even physical space, your students would come to you. If it was a classroom, they would come to your classroom. If it was a website, they would come to your learning management system, your Moodle install, and you would say, this is the URL, here's where my course notes are. So it was really, www.yourschool.com. And now we're moving to a model that's more like slash. So students were on Twitter. We're on Facebook. We are in Ustream. We're in all of these different spaces, including Foursquare, or really whatever. I mean, a million different technologies, it feels like, where the student identity is fragmented all over the web. The learning content and interactions are fragmented all over the web. And now, just to make things worse, they're increasingly a function of applications and mobile devices. A lot of you, if you're like me, spend a good portion of your time no longer interacting with URLs or website addresses. You're interacting with an application, a single function application, but it's a model that we need to wrap our heads around on what the application are of this educationally. Now, those are the open models. That's the open course system. That's the value that I see in the network processes of students solving complex problems. Let me give you a quick illustration of what this is like before I move to sort of the conclusion of my presentation. You've likely heard the quote by Albert Einstein that, the problems that we face can't be solved at the same level of thinking that we were at when we created them. It's a common quote. I've heard it more and more over the last few years. But our society is today one that's defined by complex problems. No one person, no single genius will rise up and solve these problems for us. And there's many. Everything from social concerns to poverty, global population, food crisis, peak oil, global warming. These are all problems that will not be solved by an individual. If they are solved, they will be solved by networks. They will be solved by people who are connected to one another, often globally. And I'll give you one example. You might recall, I believe it was in 2003, SARS was a big concern for international travelers. We had a high incidence of it in Canada, in Toronto in particular, and there was a fair number of people who died as a consequence. One of the first things that scientists tried to do as this virus became prominent and people recognized this as something new, they attempted to figure out how does it propagate, what is sort of the root of this virus, what are the attributes of it, how fatal is it, how do we prevent its spread, how does it begin to impact the health of a person, because that will allow us to then determine treatment models. Over a period of less than 3 months, when the SARS virus first started claiming the lives of people and getting media attention, because it was happening in smaller areas of China before it really hit media attention. When it first came out, scientists set up a global network. And this is, I think, a great example of how complex problems are solved today. And basically what they did was these research centers, centers for disease control from around the world, shared information with one another. They recognized they needed to get on top of this quickly, understand what the virus was, and be able to provide solutions for how this can be addressed. And as a consequence, what they did was, with these research centers, they used very basic technologies to share information. In fact, one report I read stated there was heavy reliance on email. But it was the mindset underneath it. What we had was a group of people who were actively engaged in saying, I have one piece of information, I'll share it with you. And then that person would take that piece of information and try to improve it and add more information to it. And then they would share it with the next research lab. And literally, as the sun went down in different parts of the world, it would be, from the Japanese research center, it would be passed off to research center in Europe, which would pass it off to Canada, United States, which would keep passing it off to Asian countries, and this cycle would continue to go. That's a brilliant model, because essentially that's the model of knowledge growth and development in complexity, right? We all have a piece of it. No one has the whole part, and the only way we're going to get a clear understanding of a problem or an opportunity is if we connect our individual isolated illustrations or knowledge examples that we have. Now, one of the things I'm getting concerned about is that in order for us to grow knowledge in our society, we need a fairly open ecosystem. As I stated earlier, the ecosystem shapes the networks that can form. Now, there are concerns with the ecosystems that we have today, and it's important for educators to be aware of what's happening in the technology space and in the information and knowledge space as well. I just posted on my eLearn space yesterday a link to an illustration of publishers. In the literally 10, 12 years ago, there were a fairly large number of publishers that dominated the publishing landscape, or these are journal publishers. So the knowledge of the universe, or the knowledge of humanity flows through these journals. In 2009, that fairly large, diverse ecosystem of publishers was reduced to 4. There are now 4 dominant journal publishers that control the mass amount of the information that's shared around the world. And that's disconcerting. It means that too many people have too much of the information, and that causes inequality. Much like in many parts of the world today, we're very aware of wealth inequality. Well, the one opportunity that people have for moving from poverty to the middle class or to wealth is education. In fact, it's really the only opportunity that many folks have, and the only opportunity that's available to most people. So what happens if the backbone of that education, the information, the knowledge that we need to connect, because keep in mind what we're talking about is connecting different knowledge pieces in order to gain solutions to complex problems. What happens if that knowledge is locked down and can't be connected by most people? What you're essentially doing is denying people even the opportunity to improve their life circumstances if they're not able to access and share that information. So I'm worried about that. I'm also worried about soft forms of lock-in. Facebook is a great example. If you're on Facebook, you're likely there because your friends are there. So when a new technology comes out, such as Google+, it's difficult to move to Google+, primarily because all of your friends are on Facebook. And that's what I call a form of soft lock-in, because tools like Facebook allow the knowledge or the information to come in, namely you post, you share, but it's much, much harder to get it out. And so it's harder, there's barriers to moving from one network to another, which I think is a significant concern for educators. There's also a big problem that we have which relates to scale. And that is that if we want to teach the way we're teaching, which is on scale, a mass scale, we're not teaching 20 students at a time or 15 students. We have schools that have hundreds or even thousands of students. We need to make better use of technology to make the learning process more human. Better use of technology to ignite the passion and the creativity that students have. In many cases, we're doing the opposite, though. We're making, through technology use, we're making learning more mechanical. We're using learning management systems which gives everybody the same content. A lot of schools lock down certain types of resources or certain types of tools that enable students to create and interact. So that's a big problem. We have on the one hand technology which holds promise, no guarantees, but holds promise for giving individual students control and creativity in order to share and express themselves. On the other hand, that same technology, we can use it to make education far more mechanical than it has ever been. So we stand at a bit of a crossroads, and I think the people that navigate or help us navigate through that crossroads are obviously the people in this room, the teachers, the educators, some of the policy makers and the decision makers that are involved. So in this regard, tools can be part of the solution, but they can also be part of the problem if we don't understand that learning is an organic human process. And if we want people to be able to interact meaningfully, to be able to solve difficult problems, we need to help them to think in non-linear, non-traditional ways. And that's, I think, sort of the calling or the goal that I would issue to individuals in this audience, is that as you consider knowledge exploration, as you consider knowledge development of your students, remember the importance of the individual. Remember the importance of the student, that what you ideally want to do is to ignite or foster the passion of a student that's there. Right now, the school system minimizes that creativity. The tools that we have, if they're improperly used, will continue to do that damage to the individual creativity of students. But on the other hand, we simultaneously can use those same technologies to give students a chance to participate in this ecosystem of problems that we're all a part of today, but gives them the ability to solve it creatively and in new and novel ways. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your hospitality. Thank you.